Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dan Brotman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Windsor Jewish Federation and Community Center. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's talk, The Persistent Prejudice, Contemporary Anti-Semitism in a Canadian Region. Our speaker, Dr. John Cappucci, is the fifth and current holder of the Stephen Jaroslawski Chair in Religion and Conflict at Assumption University. In addition to the chair, Dr. Cappucci was appointed principal and vice chancellor of Assumption University in 2020. He is the 29th leader of Assumption University since its founding as Assumption College in 1857. He holds a PhD in political science from Carleton University, a Master of Arts in Political Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, and an Honors Bachelor of Arts degree in English and Political Science from the University of Windsor. Dr. Cappucci represents Assumption University on the University of Windsor's Board of Governors, Senate, and Alumni Board of Directors. In 2020, he was elected Vice Chair of the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities in Canada. Last year, Dr. Cappucci commenced a new research project entitled The Persistent Prejudice, Contemporary Anti-Semitism in Canadian Region. The study garnered significant local and regional media attention and is the subject of this evening's talk. These two surveys on anti-Semitism in Windsor-Essex is especially pertinent in the times we're living in, given the numerous swastika incidents we experienced here in Windsor over the past couple of months, as well as the perception of a rise in anti-Semitism in Canada over the past month as the result of rising tensions between the Israelis and Palestinians. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. John Cappucci.
Thank you, Dan, for that very warm and generous welcome. It's a privilege to be here speaking with everyone on anti-Semitism. And I'm very pleased that the Windsor Jewish Federation and Community Center was able to partner with Assumption University and the chair on this event. This evening, I'm going to discuss the preliminary results of two surveys that were conducted between November 2020 and April 2021. I'm going to give an overview of anti-Semitism in Canada very briefly, talk about some of the issues in Windsor historically, and then move into how this study was conducted with members of the Windsor-Essex Jewish community. I'll go through both surveys, and then I will provide a little bit of an analysis and some final thoughts. At the end of the evening, you're more than welcome to ask questions through the chat feature on YouTube, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we have pending the time. So I'm going to ask my colleague Jessica if she can put up the PowerPoint presentation, and I'll go through the presentation itself, and we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in Windsor-Essex. It's interesting to note that when I started this study, I spoke with several members of the Jewish community before it was launched, and many of them said, well, you know, that's a good question about what the state of anti-Semitism is in Windsor-Essex. I've experienced anti-Semitism, but it was 50, 60 years ago. I was a kid. It was a different time. Others said, no, this study is very important because anti-Semitism is continuing to grow in our city, and we need more information on the exact manifestations of it and the state of it as well. So that's part of where this study came from. But a lot of it came from my previous study that I did in the Jewish community, which I did in 2019. Some of you took part in it, which was on the religious beliefs and practices in Windsor-Essex among Jews. And again, people are asking, well, what's the state of religiosity in Windsor? And we were able to do some studies about that. But while I was hearing the issues about religion, I was also hearing issues about anti-Semitism. And I said that I would revisit that issue later on in my next study. So here we are. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about Canada, just very generically, so people who may not be familiar with the topic could have a little bit of background that will be valuable as we move along. It's interesting to note that anti-Semitism in Canada has actually predates the nation of Canada itself. One of the most infamous cases of anti-Semitism in pre-Canadian history is, of course, the Hart Affair, which happened around 1807 to 1809. And in that case, a Jewish gentleman from what we call Lower Canada, but now it's called Quebec, ran for election into the legislature. He was successful. And the question, he was prepared to take the oath of office, but the oath of office included a line about a Christian subject. And as a Jew, he didn't feel comfortable taking that oath. He was prepared to swear on the Hebrew Bible, and he wore his kippah in order to mark the occasion, but he wasn't allowed to swear. He wasn't comfortable swearing that oath, and the individuals wouldn't allow him to take his seat, his fellow parliamentarians. And this went on for some time until he was actually recalled. In other words, they had to have another vote. He was reelected again for the second time, and this time he decided to take the oath, even though it mentioned Christianity. But it was one of the early instances to show the exclusionary nature of anti-Semitism in Canada, pre-Canada, I should say. We move into the birth of Canada, and we move into the 20th century. Right around the time of the rise of Nazism in Germany, we also see similar issues in Canada with the rise of anti-Semitism and individuals who are supportive of Nazism and Nazis themselves. Many of you might have heard of the Christie Pitts riots, which took place in 1933 in August, where the downtown Toronto area was in riot mode for 6 hours straight. There was something in Canada called swastika clubs, where individuals were brandishing swastikas, trying to aggravate the Jewish community and insult them. And this caused a riot. It actually started on a baseball field, of all places. And it was just one of the examples to show that anti-Semitism was, unfortunately, in Canada as well, and it gained a lot of attention, still has. One of the most infamous cases of anti-Semitism that we have in the country, and actually was mentioned, unfortunately, in the surveys, was the issue of the St. Louis. It was a ship that sailed from Hamburg, Germany in 1939, and it was set to go to Havana, Cuba, but it was denied entry at Havana, Cuba, and then the individuals started to seek asylum in the United States and Canada. They were unfortunately denied entry in the United States. They moved to Canada. They radioed the office of Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, and he also denied them entry based on the advice given to him by one of his immigration officials, Frederick Blair. And later on, Frederick Blair's nephew would apologize. But what I want to point out with the St. Louis is, of the 908 Jewish individuals on that ship, well over a quarter of them were sent to death camps and died in the Holocaust. The other quarter were uncertain of where they ended up, and many of them were scattered or went into hiding when they went back to Germany. So this is a very sad point in Canadian history. It also marks a point where we start to see anti-Semitism manifest itself. Even after the war, when you had several thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews that were displaced, if not millions, from the Shoah and the war, many of them sought entry into Canada but were denied, again, based on anti-Semitic policies that the government at the time had. And a lot of it was playing politics. But unfortunately, it wasn't an ideal situation for those seeking asylum. And of course, we have several other cases, and I have pictures, but I don't have time to get into them. Some of you from the 1980s will remember the Keekstra case that took place in Alberta. Others will remember the efforts of Ernst Zundel and his tirade against Jews and anything affiliated with Jews. And again, I'm not going to get into all of that, but you can see from these 6 pictures here, you have Ezekiel Hart in the top corner, James Keekstra in the middle. You have a swastika club in the top right. At the bottom, you have Frederick Blair, who was advising Mackenzie King on the Jewish question, and not only the Jewish question, but also the St. Louis. You have a list of the passengers of the St. Louis, and then at the bottom, you have Ernst Zundel. So this is some of the context that we're dealing with. I want to talk about what's going on now, because as you know, this study is about contemporary Canada, more specifically contemporary Windsor-Essex. Every year, the B'nai B'rith, since 1982, has published an annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents that have taken place in Canada. The report is a comprehensive, exhaustive report, and those of you that haven't had an opportunity to look at it, either in the past or now, I do encourage you to take a look because it is quite comprehensive, particularly if you're doing research on anti-Semitism for a class. But I want to talk about a little bit about the statistics. 2020 witnessed a record-breaking number of incidents taking place, anti-Semitic incidents taking place in Canada. 2,610 anti-Semitic incidences were reported. And as law enforcement agencies will tell you, and the B'nai B'rith will also echo that, there is a difference between what was reported and what actually happened. A lot of anti-Semitic incidents aren't reported. And if they're not reported, many people don't know that they've happened, except for the people that have been victimized by that. So we have 2,600 plus cases that have been reported in this country. And as I mentioned, this is the fifth year in a row that the cases, that we've seen a record-breaking number of cases. Most of the cases are related to harassment. As I mentioned, about over 2,400 are related to harassment. About another 100 are related to vandalism. And as my colleague was talking about, swastikas being painted in Windsor and graffiti and all that other nonsense, we see a lot of that unfortunately happen. And last but not least, of course, arguably the most egregious would be assaults, physical assaults. And there were in Canada last year, there were 9 instances of that. Unfortunately, and this is kind of predicting where Windsor is going to end up, if we look at Ontario, Ontario is home to, sadly enough, 43.3% of all anti-Semitic incidents in this country. And, someone who studies demography will say, well, about 40% of Canada, 35 to 40% of Canada lives in Ontario. The numbers would obviously support that. That's true. Most of the anti-Semitic cases in the country have dropped in other regions, except 2. One is Ontario, and the second one is Atlantic Canada. And I'm trying to figure out what is going on in Atlantic Canada because from 2019 to 2020, they witnessed a rise of 226% in anti-Semitic cases. So it's quite unfortunate. From a scholarly perspective, there's very few works that have been published on the Jewish community of Atlantic Canada. I can probably think of one author that I know, a sociologist who's written on Atlantic Canada Jewry. So there's more room for research if you're a young graduate student thinking about doing research on that community. If we look at the next slide, you'll see how anti-Semitism has increased year after year after year for the past 6 years, since 2015. So things are getting worse. And I'm going to talk about 2020 a little bit more because it really points, it supports the point that I want to make later on about how anti-Semitism continues to survive year after year. If we think from a historical perspective, anti-Semitism has been around in one form or another for at least 3 millennia. And it seems to continually change and manifest itself in new forms. And I think that's why it's continued to survive for so long, because it's able to do that. One last point I want to mention about the B'nai B'rith report, and this is something that some people who have studied anti-Semitism from a historical lens know that it's not surprising, but I find it very interesting and unfortunate at the same time. 44% of the cases in Canada from 2020 are anti-Semitic cases that are somehow tied to COVID-19. You're saying, what does anti-Semitism have to do with COVID-19? You're talking about 2 different things. Well, I would say both of them are viruses. But the issue is, again, the Jewish community is being blamed for COVID-19. And I mentioned historians would not find this shocking. I know many people do, but historians wouldn't, because if you look throughout history, Jews have always been blamed during periods of pandemics. For example, during the Black Plague, there were beliefs that Jews were, contaminating the wells, and that's how the Black Plague spread throughout Europe. Again, all this kind of nonsense, but nonetheless, it's this medieval idea has manifested itself in the modern age. So it's unfortunate, but we can talk about that a little later. I want to discuss the study itself now. So I approached this project with the idea of trying to find out what is the current state of anti-Semitism in Windsor-Essex. When I do a study, I always like to include our colleagues and friends from the county. I just don't want to limit it to Windsor. Two reasons for that. One, I don't like to limit people from participating in research studies. And secondly, I think that if we look at it from a statistical perspective, many of you have received your census data, and I encourage you to fill that out because that's how we get a lot of information as scholars. The census metropolitan area incorporates quite a bit of the county, not all of Essex County, but a substantial portion of it. So I thought it would get a better picture if we open it up for members of the Essex community. There was two purposes of this study. The first one was to figure out what the community thought about anti-Semitism in Windsor-Essex. What was the perception of anti-Semitism? They didn't have to have experienced anti-Semitism to participate. They just have to have an opinion. The second one was on the manifestations of anti-Semitism. One is the questions that scholars have, and it's a good question, is trying to figure out which form of anti-Semitism is the most prevalent. As you know, anti-Semitism has many ugly heads, and we're going to talk about that later on this evening. The question is which one is most prevalent and why is it most prevalent? And I'm going to get to that later on as we move on. So how did I conduct this study? Well, continue, as you understand, we were living, and we still are, in a pandemic. So my way of doing things is usually face-to-face interviews. And I find that you get the best information when you have a face-to-face conversation with somebody. But during a pandemic, that's not possible. And it's not safe for the researcher or the participants. So in that case, what we decided to do was to conduct online surveys, which would be the safest course of action. So I used an online survey software called Qualtrics, which some of you might have heard. It's a wonderful software, very detailed, and it allows you to study from multiple angles, and that's what was used. The call for participants was kindly disseminated by our friends at the Windsor Jewish Federation Community Center, Congregation Shar Hashemayim, and Congregation Temple Bethel. So all these three organizations sent out the call for participants and the letter of information to their respective memberships. And then they were asked to contact me, and I provided a link and a password, and people were able to take the surveys. The surveys themselves were open from November 2020 to April 2021. So there was a good period of time for people to learn about the study and to take part in them if they did qualify. And I'm going to talk about that next. So in order to take part in the study, there were two surveys, as I mentioned. The first one, you had to identify as Jewish. You had to be at least 18 years of age or older and live in Windsor-Essex County. Now, as I mentioned, we are living in a pandemic, so some people might have been quarantining elsewhere, and they mentioned that to me, and they were welcome to take the survey. The second survey, you needed the three characteristics I just mentioned, and you had to have experienced anti-Semitism within the last 5 years. Now, the reason 5 years was chosen is due to the fact that this study is, one of the words in the study title is contemporary anti-Semitism. We want to look at what's going on today, on relatively within the last few years. Many people contact me and said, John, I've experienced anti-Semitism, but it was 40 years ago. It was 30 years ago. It was 50 years ago. Well, I was a kid when I was growing up. It was after the war. And they said, I haven't experienced much lately. So that was encouraging to hear. But I realized that, like I mentioned before, anti-Semitism is quite insidious. It pops its head up all the time in one form or other. So I realized that there was much more to say than the last 40 years. So the reason why I split the study up into two surveys, I wanted everyone to have an opportunity to participate. So some people may not have experienced anti-Semitism, or they experienced it 30 years ago, and I still wanted them to have an opinion and a say on what the state of anti-Semitism is in the community. So that's where the first survey came into play. And then if people have experienced anti-Semitism in the last 5 years, they could do both surveys if they liked, or just one or the other. But again, it's a way of providing opportunities for people to voice their concerns and share their experiences. So how do you conduct a survey? This is good for the graduate students and the undergrad students in the audience. I know we have a few. You begin first and foremost by asking the screening questions that I talked about. So it began when people had to check off those 3 or 4 screening questions. Are you Jewish? Are you 18? Do you live in Windsor-Essex? And if you're doing the second one, have you experienced anti-Semitism? And then I opened it up to learn a little bit about the demographics. I'm very big on to try to find the demographics, a better picture of the Jewish community. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. One of the big debates we have in the Jewish community, and I've shared this with Dan as well as the new executive director, is a big debate, and it's hopefully going to get solved soon, on how many Jewish people live in the Windsor-Essex community. And I've heard a lot of theories. Officially, and it's dated, but I'm going to say what the official thing is. Officially, there are 1,515 Jews living in the census metropolitan area of Windsor-Essex. So what does that mean? It means Jews living in Windsor, LaSalle, Amesburg, Lakeshore, and Tecumseh. 1,515. The problem with that number is that it's over 10 years old now. It was from the census of 2011. So that's why I tell people to do the census, because you can get some more information for researchers like me to know about the community. Now, that's the official number. Many people say it's not 1,515, it's much smaller. That seems to be the majority opinion. That is supported by historical trends, because as I was talking a little bit earlier with my colleagues, since probably the 1970s, you've noticed significant drops in the Jewish community and population-wise. So I would suspect that when the census data is released this year or next year, depending on how Stats Canada can move and Census Canada can move, I would suspect that maybe the community would be smaller than 1,515. I would project somewhere between 1,000 and maybe 1,100. I could be wrong, but I'm suspecting that. And of course, it's a matter of debate. But anyways, that just will, I don't want to get too much into the population size, because it's anybody's game. So what were some of the demographic questions I asked? I asked people, of course, things like their age, their gender, which branch of Judaism they identified with, their education background, do they wear identifiable clothing such as a kippah or a Star of David pendant or necklace or something like that. So those were some of the questions I asked, and to kind of get a better picture of the community itself. And at the end of the survey, what was very important for us is to provide some resources to people. Both if they've experienced anti-Semitism, there were some help counseling services that they could call into. There were hotlines they could report the anti-Semitic instances. There was the police services, of course, the emergency and non-emergency numbers were there. So we gave people resources just in case. And of course, I provided some academic resources as people wanted to read more about anti-Semitism, not only in Canada itself, but historically outside of Canada as well. So we provided some good resources. And last but not least, something I always do when I do surveys or interviews, I like to give the participants something for their time. And like I did with my study on religiosity, in this case, I also gave an $18 gift card to Amazon, and people seem to enjoy that. And everyone who completed the survey or started the survey got the $18 gift card. And the reason for 18, for those in the Jewish community, you probably know, but for the non-Jewish viewers, 18 is a very lucky number in Judaism and Jewish culture. It represents life because it combines two letters, chet and yud. And when you put chet and yud together, you form the word chai, which means life. And each of those letters has a numerical value, 1 of 10, 1 of 8. If you add them together, you get 18. So that's why 18 is a lucky number. And typically, when you give gifts in the Jewish community, you give them in multiples of 18. So 18, 36, 72, 180, whatever you like. So that's the reason for 18. I know some people were kind of puzzled, why not just $20? But 18 is a special number. So let's talk a little bit about the first survey. The first survey demographics. So we received 49 participants, which is pretty good. The dynamic was 21 female to 28 male. The average age was 49, just over 49, which is actually smaller, which is younger than the average age in the Jewish community right now. And in fact, in my last study, I believe the average age was 62 of participants. So this is noticeably younger. And there's a few reasons for that that you can take a look at. One of them is, of course, the method of choice here. In this case, we used an online survey. And if you look at Statistics Canada, which I always take a look at, the majority of, I think it's about 75% of people 65 or older have access to a computer. So it's a sizable number, but it gets much higher when you look at people who are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, who are nearly 100% access to a computer or some kind of device. So I think that's the limitation, is that for people who may not have access to a computer, and there are still people that don't, they weren't able to take part in the study per se, and that was one of the limitations. But given the pandemic, there's not much one can do. The level of education, most of the participants, at least the largest grouping, have undergraduate degrees, so 38%, a sizable number. Again, the largest portion were part of the Reform branch of Judaism, 32%. The diasporic origins, so Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, so on and so forth, nearly 75% are coming from the Ashkenazi branch. In reference to identifiable clothing or attire, I asked questions like, do you wear a kippah? Do you wear a Star of David? Things like that. And it seemed that most would wear some kind of jewelry, like a pendant or a bracelet, a Star of David, or maybe I just mentioned high. They would have high as well. So that seemed to be the most popular. And impressively enough, the average years in Windsor was around 37 years. So the community that was surveyed, I should say the sample that was surveyed, knew quite a bit about Windsor. So this was a community that knew what was going on. Now, what I want to do is I want to provide a brief snapshot. I know we have only about an hour's time, but I still want to give you kind of a snapshot on what the first survey looked at. And then if there are questions, I'm more than happy to answer them at the end. So the first survey wanted to give an idea about the state of anti-Semitism. It wanted to look at, do people feel safe living in Windsor-Essex? What is their concern with the current state of anti-Semitism? What could the Jewish community do to fight anti-Semitism? What could the non-Jewish community do to fight anti-Semitism? How does Windsor-Essex compare to another area in Canada? What's likely going to happen in the next 5 years? Is anti-Semitism going to increase? Is it going to decrease? Is it going to stay relatively the same? So those are some of the questions the first survey looked at. And I realize the last one is kind of asking people to peer into the future. But nonetheless, based on what they've seen, given this community was fairly well established in Windsor, being here for about 37 years, I thought it was a worthwhile question to present. So let's talk about the first question that I asked in the survey. And it was about level of concern. And I asked people very, honestly and clearly, what do you feel, essentially, what is the level of concern that you have about the current state of anti-Semitism? So in other words, how are you feeling about what's going on in Windsor? A lot of the concern that people mentioned, and I should mention that people had three options. They could say, I have a high level of concern, I have a moderate level of concern, or I have a low level of concern. A lot of the concern was surrounding Israel. Okay, there was a lot of anti-Israel sentiments that were manifesting themselves in various forms. And that was then turning into forms that were making people very uncomfortable. So we can talk a little bit about that when I get to it. Other issues were related to examples of anti-Semitism that they've seen, such as graffiti. People mentioned that bricks and that stars of David were crossed out, or people spray painted swastikas, or other racial comments and words like that were offensive. People were concerned about that, and also the vandalism that went on as well. People throwing bricks or rocks or stones, or defacing the cemetery, or defacing a synagogue or a temple, the JCC, or something like that. There were concerns about that they were seeing. And there was also concerns about issues that were going on campus. That some of them actually were beyond the 5-year mark, but they still mentioned it, and they actually recognized that. One of them was the issues that they said happened. Well, it happened 6 years ago, but I'll still talk about it. Others mentioned the concern of the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which is focused on the state of Israel. So there were concerns all around these issues that were mentioned. As I mentioned, participants got to say what their level of concern, and then they got to explain. So you can't see the percentages; they're not showing up for some reason here, but you can see that a majority, unfortunately, have a moderate concern with what's going on in Windsor. And the minimal concern seems to be the second most common choice, but the severe concern, unfortunately, is the last. And for those of you that are wondering, color code, I picked a traffic light to kind of give you an idea, right? Red is bad, stop, and green is go, and yellow or amber is kind of middle. So there was a moderate concern with the state of I think it was around 59%, if I'm not mistaken. Again, a moderate concern with what was going on in Windsor. And I kind of suspected that. I didn't think there was going to be a high level of concern. I thought there was going to be some of that. But I certainly wasn't sold on the idea of a low level of concern. I very much believe that there was going to be a moderate concern, at least among a majority of participants. And in this case, my hypothesis proved correct. But as I go in throughout the rest of the study, you're going to see that I'm not going to be correct all the time. So as I kind of already mentioned, the sense of safety, about 59%. There were some issues with slurs being said in the community, comments. So this is actually somewhat good to see that a majority, so about 3 out of 5 participants, feel safe living in Windsor-Essex County, okay? It's not a number to write home about, certainly, but nonetheless, 3 out of 5 isn't terrible. And keep in mind, this was done a few months ago, so the numbers could have certainly changed. They could have gone up or they could have gone down. People did mention they've heard some comments, anti-Semitic comments, some very unfortunate slurs and language that people have said. And there, sadly enough, people have tried to conceal their Jewish heritage because of fears for their safety, and fears of kind of getting it, not only their safety, but even these awkward situations where someone says something and you're forced with the responding or not responding, and then provoking an argument or a fight or something worse than that. I should note that while 3 out of 5 is not the greatest number, it could be worse. I still think that vigilance is obviously very, very much still important. So while 3 out of 5 is not terrible, vigilance is still very important. In this question, participants, as you can see, my numbers aren't showing up, but that you can see from the slides here, the pie charts. People, one person mentioned, and it resonated with me. I remembered it from the study because it's something that I never forgot, and I saw it again in the study, is when the community gathers to celebrate, let's say, Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or somehow, Hanukkah. There's a police presence usually there at the Shar or at Temple Bethel. And it's puzzling that that's needed, but it unfortunately is needed because of the safety concerns that many people in the community have. And it's very sad because someone who studies religion and been studying religion for many years now, I don't see that in any other religious community that I visited where there's a police presence to enter and to exit. So that resonated me when that person mentioned that in the comment section. So the question that I thought was, and many people have lived in other cities either for schooling or for work, or they were born in another city and they came to Windsor for whatever. The question is, how does Windsor compare with other regions? And again, this question is based on the idea that somebody's lived outside of Windsor, which is true, and many people have, but maybe not the case. Those who said that there is a higher level of anti-Semitism in Windsor pointed to the fact that this has to do with the size of the Jewish community. So as a social scientist, they would say that's an inverse relationship. As one goes up, the other one goes down. In other words, anti-Semitism is rising in Windsor because there are fewer and fewer Jews. So there's less of a support network, less of a visibility, less of engagement. And that might resonate with some people, but I should note that in communities which have large Jewish communities, and I'm thinking of Toronto, the largest in the country, anti-Semitism is still very visible and very prevalent in the city of Toronto. Then on the other side of the argument, I'm thinking of Atlantic Canada with the data that we just received, I would say shocking data, which has witnessed over a 226% increase in anti-Semitism. And between the four Atlantic provinces, I highly doubt that there would be, much more than 1,000 members of the Jewish community. I could be wrong, but maybe more, maybe less. But it's interesting to note that the reason for that. Others said, look, anti-Semitism is all over the place. Windsor is no different than anywhere else. It's no different than Toronto. It's no different than Halifax. It's no different than Vancouver and Montreal. So it's going to happen everywhere. Windsor is nothing special. That was those who said it's pretty much the same. Those who said that it was lower actually started referencing the larger cities that I was talking about. So the Montreal, the Toronto, the Vancouver, the Calgary, the Edmonton. They were referencing those larger Jewish centers and saying, look, I've experienced a lot of anti-Semitism when I was riding on the subway in Toronto, or I've experienced a lot of anti-Semitism when I was walking down this neighborhood in Montreal. So again, people say it really depends on the individual's experiences. It's difficult to predict. But if you look at the next slide and you see the chart, again, you got a majority that pretty much believe it's the same the same level in Windsor-Essex as elsewhere. However, I should note in this case, there is a higher level as the second most common response, growing. And I think that's a matter that we need to be very concerned about, because if that continues to grow, it's going to eclipse the same level, and you're going to have a higher level in comparison to other cities. And that could be a problem. So, one of the questions that I asked, it was a very practical question. Some scholars wouldn't ask practical questions like this, but I thought, why not? It asked two questions. One, what could the Jewish community do to fight anti-Semitism? And what could the non-Jewish community do to fight anti-Semitism? So both, there was both sides trying to make a point on what could be done. And I recognize that there is an overlap between those two questions, but I still wanted to ask them. One of the most, in both cases, and as I mentioned, I know they're related, is education. Many, many people suggested that this is based on ignorance and education is the cure. I would agree with that. Naturally, as someone who teaches and is in the academic field, I would agree that education is needed. I think education needs to start at the primary level. It goes to the secondary level and forward from there. And it always needs to happen. It shouldn't just be when you're in grade school and secondary school. Education always needs to be there to talk about anti-Semitism. And I'm very proud of the students that I've taught in my time who were learning about Anne Frank in grade school or high school, or Elie Wiesel. And then when they came to university, they had at least a foundation of understanding of what some of the issues were. And then they could get more of the issues when they came to university or college. So I think education is critical, and it's got to be a perennial event. and it's got to be ubiquitous. It's got to be universal. It can't just be targeting one age group or demographic. It's got to be all the time and everywhere. And talking about anti-Semitism, the causes of anti-Semitism, what's the state of anti-Semitism, because as I'm going to mention later on, anti-Semitism has a habit of concealing itself and then popping up out of nowhere. It has that throughout history. It's a very insidious, I'm going to say ideology, but you can call it what you want. Another suggestion by the participants was more dialogue, talking to people from outside the Jewish community and with the Jewish community on what's going on. And that might work as, kind of a committee that's coming from people from various religious backgrounds, sitting together and talking about ways to fight anti-Semitism in our community. It might be something like that, raising awareness, having an awareness campaign, again, maybe an education campaign. But I think it's important that people see that, and I'm going to say this multiple times, that anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. Anti-Semitism is a human problem. And like all forms of discrimination, it's a human problem. And the humanity as a whole needs to get involved to combat anti-Semitism. And that leads to my other point, and was mentioned, was collaboration, doing events together. Just like what we're doing tonight. You have a Catholic university partnering with a Jewish community center. It's something important to see for the community, various groups working together. And we've done that a lot in Windsor, actually. I think there's room for more. And I know it's difficult now with the pandemic, but hopefully we can get out of this soon. One person that I was reading the responses suggested do something with food. We actually kind of did that a few years ago with the hummus festival. And you had various groups coming together and sharing a meal and sharing food. And that really helps to build bonds. And I think that's important. And also, similar to the collaboration, but also social events. People were talking about having a book club that was together with various different groups that can talk about issues, or a film club, or different types of clubs that people can work together, teams, and an event that crosses different ethnic and religious lines, and maybe a charitable event too. And I know these things have been tried, but something is better than nothing. Even if they don't succeed the first year, that's usually what happens with events. It takes time for them to succeed. But the key is obviously collaboration across the lines. I think that's very important. And to know that the Jewish community has friends, and there is a sense of solidarity with the Jewish community from various other communities that are non-Jewish as well. I remember a few years ago, those of you that remember, when the Pittsburgh massacre happened, the Windsor-Essex community and religious and spiritual leaders from, I would say, at least 10 different groups came to Temple Bethel, and they were all on the bima, and they were all there praying in support with the Jewish community. So even in that time of darkness, the time of that massacre, there was still a glimmer of light that was there in the hope. And it was the most packed event I've seen at Temple Bethel. I think there was just standing room only, if I'm not mistaken. So that's what I like to see more of. And I think people will realize that that's something important to try to cultivate. Again, I know it's difficult with the pandemic, but this too shall pass. And another question I asked was, what's going to happen in the next 5 years? Again, this asks people to be a little bit prophetic in nature, but nonetheless, it's important. When I analyzed the results on this, there was a lot of what ifs. And, if this continues, then this is going to happen. And a lot of it depends on internal and external factors. From an internal perspective, people were talking about the size of the community being one. If the community starts to shrink more and more and more, then anti-Semitism will rise. That seemed to be a trend that the participants seemed to put forward. Now, whether there's validity or not in that, remains to be seen. But that was something that was very common. Also, the leadership of the community, where the leaders of the Jewish community will lead, it depends upon their leadership, essentially, what people were trying to say. And also the visibility of the community. And this is a debatable issue. As I mentioned, there seems to be this belief that the larger the community, the less anti-Semitism. I don't know if I'm entirely sold on that argument. I can see both sides of the coin, but I'm not entirely sold on it. So those were some of the ideas that were mentioned from an internal perspective. From an external perspective, there were concerns about immigration from the Middle East and issues related to a move towards inclusivity. So people were concerned about ideas that were common in the Middle East, bringing them over to Canada, and then attacking the Jewish community based on that. That's what a lot was being was talked about in that. I don't know about that really, because I have to say that I'm seeing a lot of positivity coming from individuals who are coming from the Middle East, who are realizing that what's going on there is going on there, and this is a new start. It's a fresh start. It's something new in Canada. So I see both sides of the coin, but I'm hopeful that people will move forward from there. And also there's a movement towards including people more and more. And this is including people from various backgrounds, as I was talking about in the previous slide. So people from, welcoming them into to the community, regardless of religious background or ethnic background or whatever. And people saying, okay, I understand what the participants were trying to say here. They're trying to say, look, at 50 years ago, the Catholics were on one side of the street in Windsor, the Anglicans were on one side of the street, and the Jews were on the corner over there, and that's how things were done. Everybody stuck to their side, and nobody mixed, and everybody avoided the other, and that. Yeah, I get that was the case. I understand. But now lately, I've seen more of a trend, and even the participants have mentioned it, towards including people from various and engaging with people from various different backgrounds. And that's a hopeful sign. I would say that's a very hopeful sign. So again, the community is very divided on that. Again, people believe that anti-Semitism is likely going to remain the same for the next 5 years, but it's not a majority in this case. Many people believe it's going to increase, and there's a small portion that believe it's going to decrease. I think this represents one of the most divided responses in the entire first survey, where usually you see a majority come through. In this one, you don't. You see that the participant community is quite divided on what's going to happen in the next 5 years. And if you think about the question, it's asking, well, what do you think is going to happen in 5 years? Anything can happen in 5 years. If you asked us 5 years ago, will we be in a pandemic like we are today? I think all of us would have said absolutely not. That was just madness to think of, but yet here we are. So it's a difficult question to ask, but it's a good way to end any survey, is to always ask a question about the future. Okay, I want to take a look at Survey 2. So Survey 2 is, it was open to, again, people of Jewish, who identified as Jewish, 18 years or older, live in Windsor-Essex. And they had to have experienced anti-Semitism within the last 5 years. I picked 5 years because of the contemporary nature. I wanted to kind of get a snapshot of what's going on in the last 5 years. In this case, there were 27 participants. So it was a smaller sample. And that was predicted because, as I mentioned, many people in the Jewish community said, John, I'm happy to give you my opinion but on what's going on right now, but I haven't experienced anti-Semitism in the last 5 years. It was a while ago. Others took the opposite position and said, where do I sign up? I've experienced anti-Semitism in the last 5 years, and I'm happy to share my thoughts with you. Again, there were 12 females, 15 males. The age range was similar to the first one, around 45 years. Again, undergraduate degree, so these people have university credentials. In this case, it's a split between Reform and Conservative. Both have 25.93% each. So it's a little bit, I would say, closer to the more liturgical conservative side, but we'll see with the results. Again, mostly Ashkenazi, and then mostly wearing, if they're wearing any identifiable clothing, it's mostly necklaces or pendants or things like that. Again, a large group of them have been in Windsor for well over 30 years. so they're cognizant of what's going on in the community. So what did this second survey ask? This second survey was focused entirely on the types of anti-Semitism experienced by the participants. It wasn't just enough to say, yes, I experienced anti-Semitism. The question then becomes, what type of anti-Semitism? And many people who are watching tonight are saying there's types of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, yes. As I mentioned, anti-Semitism has many ugly heads. And there are many more than the ones I covered in the survey. I didn't want to make it too taxing for people, so that's why I only covered some. People were asked yes and no questions, and then they had an opportunity to explain. And I'm going to go through some of the types of anti-Semitism tonight. I know we only have about an hour of time, but I'm happy to answer questions if people aren't sure of what was meant by that type of anti-Semitism. I should note that at the end of the survey, people could answer if they've experienced any other type of anti-Semitism not listed here. And some people shared specific examples rather than types. So here's a list of 7 types of anti-Semitism. And before we move on to the next slide, and Jessica, you can help me through the chat feature, but I want to include the audience, if I may. I want to ask them if these are the 7 types, which one they think is the most prevalent in the survey, and then I will tell you which one was the most prevalent, because one of these 7 types came out ahead, and I was actually quite surprised that it did, because I was thinking that it wasn't going to be as common as you thought. So I'll give you a minute if you want to write in the YouTube chat, and I'll get a drink of water. Which one of the 7 you think is the most prevalent? Okay, it looks like I'm going to go back to the slide now. This is one way of including the audience. Actually, it looks like that this is a smart audience, because the audience suggested religious anti-Semitism or political-based anti-Semitism were the most prevalent, and in fact, religious anti-Semitism, unfortunately, was the most prevalent type of anti-Semitism, which I was quite a little bit surprised of. I knew it was going to be pretty popular, but I thought that some of these tired old tropes would have fallen into the dustbin of history, but unfortunately, I was wrong. So let's talk a little bit about religious-based anti-Semitism. Again, 81% of the participants who took part in the survey experienced religious-based anti-Semitism. It's the most common type of anti-Semitism, and it can appear in many types of forms. So the first type of form, which you might have heard of, is essentially a distaste and a dislike for Judaism as the religion. People mentioned that there were comments on Judaism as a religion, and they critiqued it very harshly, that it was, a quote, stupid religion, and so on and so forth. And that's one type of religious-based anti-Semitism, just, blatant critiques. The second type that you can see in this, and that manifested itself according to the participants, is, again, the tired argument of deicide. And deicide means death of a god. And it's the blaming of the Jewish community for the crucifixion of Jesus. And this is something that Christian communities have denounced and said, look, this is not what we believe. Speaking from the Roman Catholic perspective, this is something that the church has denounced. Nonetheless, this type of belief, the deicide charge, which is unfortunately a vestige of the Middle Ages, even before, is still manifests itself in the third decade of the 21st century, and blaming Jews for the crucifixion. And it's shocking to see that type of belief still exists. Others were slurs and insults and so on and so forth that have existed. A lot of insulting, a lot of slurs, a lot of comments were manifest when it came to religious-based anti-Semitism. So it's very unfortunate to see that. The next common type of anti-Semitism that was found within this participant sample was Holocaust denial. Again, another all these forms of anti-Semitism are distasteful, but this one is particularly distasteful because it ignores the death of over 6 million Jews at the hands of the Nazis and their allies. 60%, just about 60%, 3 out of 5 of the participants experienced personal instances of Holocaust denial. And that was particularly shocking because you would think that a historically established fact like the Holocaust and the death of 6 million plus Jews would be accepted by now. And only fringe radical groups believe that it didn't happen. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And this Holocaust denial manifests itself in 2 forms, I would say. There were people who blatantly denied it and said it didn't happen, which is unbelievable to me, but okay. And others said, well, there's reasons for the Holocaust, which is also, I would say, probably equally shocking to me too. That there was reasons for what? That there was somebody mentioned that somebody said to them that Hitler knew what the Jews were up to, and as a result, did the Holocaust. So, in other words, making excuses for the Holocaust. And I don't even know if you could do that, but that's what was going on. Or perhaps even saying, well, the Holocaust happened. Yes, I agree with you, but 6 million didn't die. Maybe a few 100,000 died. It was a number the 6 million is an exaggeration. So minimizing the factuality of the Holocaust was another form. And this was shocking to see. This was shocking to see that this was going on. But, unfortunately, if we're using other data too, looking at the national scene, it's common to see forms of Holocaust denial happen, not only in one-to-one comments, but also blatantly spray painted and vandalized, and also through online forums as well. That's quite popular. Political anti-Semitism, again, manifests itself in various forms, but one of the common forms that was manifested in the second survey was that there was a Jewish influence over various spheres of society, be it politics, be it the banks, be it the economy, be it universities, be it anything. There was a kind of a conspiracy within these realms. And this again is a tired stereotype and a tired belief that goes back centuries. Unfortunately, even to the so-called father of anti-Semitism, Wilhelm Marr himself, and he coined the term anti-Semitism. It's a little bit different spelling that we have today, but when the German economy crashed in the 1870s, he believed it was the Jews' fault. Okay, and unfortunately, that's a common belief that anything bad that happens is the Jews' fault. And we were talking at the beginning of the presentation about COVID-19. The same thing happened with COVID-19, where people are blaming the Jews for COVID-19. Again, A has nothing to do with B, but in the mind of anti-Semites, A always has something to do with B. And these types of comments, again, it's all forms of comments. Or maybe in some cases there's some vandalism too, but fortunately we don't see any assaults. I haven't seen any assaults mentioned or physical violence. So I think that's a good thing, but and that follows the national trend as well. Usually the assaults are the smallest, but they are the most egregious. And these things happen in workplaces, they happen in school settings. Some of them even happened at house parties before the pandemic happened, where people were talking about an issue and then all of a sudden the Jews were blamed, or the Jews were said they control this or they control that. So just horrible things like that. very much in poor taste, to say the least. Economic anti-Semitism can come in a lot of different forms. All of these forms come in different forms. On one hand, you can look at the kind of the older version of economic anti-Semitism, which is essentially discriminating against Jews in the economic setting. So, I spoke to one member of the Jewish community, an older member of the Jewish community, who said, years ago, there was things when if you wanted a job, there were lines that said Jews need not apply. I would consider that a form of economic anti-Semitism, where you're not allowed to apply to a job because you're Jewish, or you're not allowed to be part of a particular profession. If we go back even further, because you're Jewish, if you go to the Middle Ages, you'll see that many of the guilds, the trade guilds that existed during that time and into the Renaissance, Jews were excluded. So they had to rely on their themselves, their own families and themselves, in order to find work. So another tired, some of these stereotypes are just tiring to read over and over again. But I think this one was very common, whereas the word Jew was turned into a verb for bargaining. And that phrase was used over and over again in the responses, where participants were saying, somebody said this phrase and said it like this. And I said, well, that's offensive to me. And then there was an argument that ensued. Again, based on tired old stereotypes, there was references to a neighborhood in Windsor, some of you might know, that has a very unflattering name attached to it because of its alleged prevalence of Jewish citizens there. And again, tiresome, just tiresome, poor taste, certainly poor taste, and also tiresome. Yeah, racial anti-Semitism was another question we asked. And again, this revolved around mostly physical attributes. And throughout the comment section in the survey, people were saying things like, well, somebody said, I don't look Jewish, or I look too Jewish. And in a lot of cases, people said, well, what is a Jew supposed to look like? And, some people, the anti-Semites that said that thing, responded, again, with tired old stereotypes from the past. And, very offensive to the individuals. They shouldn't have to hear statements like that based on caricatures, which that's what they are, of Jewish people. But nonetheless, it is prevalent, and sadly so. This is where racial and cultural anti-Semitism actually seemed to be the catch-all in the survey, where it kind of picked up everything. And I wasn't surprised, because when I was studying for my doctorate, there are ways of studying political science through a cultural lens. And the article I was reading said political scientists tend to avoid cultural studies of political science because they're a little bit challenging, and culture can mean a lot of things. And that's true. Culture can mean a lot of things. So I left this question very much open. But if we're going to look back in time, cultural anti-Semitism is based on the idea that Jews are purveyors of some kind of inferior culture, or culture that is associated with all kinds of social maladies and ills. Things like gambling to prostitution to things like that. All these ridiculous beliefs. And again, some of these are also tying in Israel. Israel is also coming into the conversation. So, but nonetheless, for many people, it was comments, again, based on Jewish culture and expressed as a very general term. So what are my final thoughts here? And I know there's a lot I threw at you, and we're happy we're somewhat on time. But as I mentioned, and when I teach, and when I talk to communities, and when I talk to people, I always say that anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem, it's a human problem. Meaning that the entirety of the citizenry of a community need to get involved in order to stop anti-Semitism as much as possible. And I know that's a tall order, but I really believe that the community as a whole needs to get involved as much as possible. And that's Jewish and non-Jewish. And I'm happy to see that both non-Jewish and Jewish communities are working more and more together. on a variety of events. As I mentioned, that event at Temple Bethel a few years ago, you had about 10 different people from different religious backgrounds on the stage there. And it was heartwarming for the Jewish community to see that level of support. So maybe we can take some of that support and put it towards combating anti-Semitism. And I think a lot of this, and a lot of the participants mentioned it as well. Education would go a long way. Learning about anti-Semitism, where it comes from, how it's manifested itself historically, how it's manifested itself in Canada, how it's appeared also in Ontario and in Windsor and cities across the country. I think that's important as well, because people, some of them they're not anti-Semitic, they just aren't aware of what's going on. As one professor of mine always said, she says, 90% of plagiarism is unintentional. That's true. And I think that some people aren't there. I don't want to use the word ignorant because it's a little bit, negative language, but I think they're just not educated about the subject. And I think that's where a patient mind and a patient ear needs to come in there. And last but not least, I want to quote a romantic, Charles Baudelaire, who said one of the greatest tricks the devil ever did was convince people he doesn't exist. Well, I want to kind of channel him and say one of the greatest tricks anti-Semitism has pulled is convincing people it's no longer a problem. And I think that's what I want to level off on, to remind people, yes, there is a problem. Yes, vigilance is in order. And to remember that we as a community, not just as a Jewish community, but as a community across Windsor-Essex, need to work together so we can ensure that anti-Semitism is minimized as much as possible. So I want to thank you all, as you can see, for listening to me for the past hour. It's been a pleasure. I'm happy to share my preliminary results with you. I want to, at the top of the list, I want to thank our partners from the Windsor Jewish Federation Community Center, our friend and our executive director, Dan Brotman, for introducing me, a very generous, maybe too generous introduction, but I thank him for that. I also want to thank the JCC, Congregation Shara HaShemayim, Congregation Temple Bethel for disseminating the letter of participants and so on. I was really fortunate to have that level of support from the community in disseminating the call for participants and promoting the survey and so on. I also, on that note of participants, I want to thank the participants who took part in the study. Many of them were very eager and engaged to take part in the study, and I'm happy that they shared their thoughts and their feelings with me, and hopefully this will be for the benefit of the community. On my side, I'd like to thank our team at Assumption University. Jessica Lemon has been helping us with Zoom and broadcasting this from our YouTube channel. I want to thank Cecile Bertrand, Cassandra Skipper, and Moira Belmore for also helping. And of course, last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank the Stephen Jaroslavsky Foundation. Without them, this would not have been possible. The chair at Assumption was used in order to support this. My colleagues at Assumption University, the board, and of course, the Basilian Fathers of Sandwich for also their support in endowing the chair. So at this juncture, I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have. If you have any questions, I know we're a little bit early, but you're welcome to put them in the chat feature, and I'll do the best I can to answer them. We have time for a few questions. Everybody is overwhelmed with so much information. That's why there's no questions, right? Okay. Well, you guys let me off very easily, but thank you very much. It was a pleasure working with you all, and I'm happy to share some of my results this evening. I thank you all and wish you all the best and have a restful and safe summer. So thank you all and have a good evening.